If you were to stand at the edge of the Mesa Verde Plateau in southern Colorado during the high noon of a summer solstice, you would experience a heat so aggressive it feels physical. The air shimmers, distorting the horizon. The silence is absolute, broken only by the dry rattle of a cicada or the scream of a red-tailed hawk. It is a landscape that wants to kill you. Dehydration here is not a slow process. It is a rapid shutdown of the body's systems. The sun is a hammer and the earth is an anvil. Yet, if you look down, past the edge of the precipice, over the lip of a sheer drop that would shatter bones in a heartbeat, you will see something impossible. Tucked into the vertical face of the canyon wall, hundreds of feet above the valley floor and just below the mesa top, lies a city. It is not a cave. It is a complex, multi-story masonry metropolis, built of shaped stone and mortar, hanging in the void. This is the Cliff Palace. This is the architecture of the Ancestral Puebloans. For over 700 years, these people lived on the flat, forested mesa tops. They were farmers, growing corn and squash. But then, around the year 1190 AD, something shifted in the psyche of an entire civilization. In a massive, coordinated effort, they abandoned their homes on the flatland and moved into the abyss. They moved their children, their elderly, their food, and their fire into the most inaccessible, dangerous crevices of the canyon. To get a drink of water meant scaling a vertical wall. To visit a neighbor meant walking a ledge inches wide. Why? Why would a civilization choose to live on the edge of a knife? Was it fear of a human enemy? Was it a religious mandate? Or was it something far more pragmatic? To survive the brutal climate shifts that were coming, they had to do something that defies modern logic. They had to turn the geology of the earth itself into a machine. To understand the cliff dwellings, you must first understand the enemy. In the American Southwest, the enemy is not a singular thing. It is a trinity of terror: the sun, the cold, and the drought. This is a high desert environment. In the summer, temperatures soar over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In the winter, they plummet well below zero. It is a land of extremes where a shelter that works in July will kill you in January. A simple tent or a thin-walled hut cannot mediate a 100-degree temperature swing. For centuries, the ancestral Puebloans lived in pithouses, semi-subterranean structures dug into the mesa top. These were effective, utilizing the Earth's insulation. But as the population grew and the climate began to destabilize in the 12th century, the mesa top became a trap. It was exposed to the relentless wind. It was exposed to raiding parties who could easily spot a village from miles away. And critically, it occupied the only arable land available for farming. Every square foot of housing was a square foot of lost corn. But there was another threat, one less visible but more deadly. The great drought was approaching. The hydrological cycle was breaking down. The rains stopped coming. The water table dropped. Living on the mesa top meant being far from the few trickling springs that seeped out of the canyon walls below. They were facing a civilizational collapse driven by climate change. Modern solutions would fail here. We would pump water uphill with electricity. They had none. We would use air conditioning. They had only wind. We would use steel. They had only stone. They needed a location that solved all three problems: defense, climate control, and water access simultaneously. They looked over the edge of the cliff into the great sandstone alcoves carved by eons of wind and water, and they saw a solution. But to claim it, they would have to become engineers of the vertical world. The first struggle was not building the walls, it was accessing the site. Imagine the initial descent. These alcoves are not at the bottom of the canyon. They are suspended in the middle of the geological layer known as the cliff house sandstone. To reach them, the builders had to carve hand and toe holds directly into the sheer rock face. These trails, known as the Moki steps, are terrifyingly shallow. A slip meant death. Yet they carried everything down these steps. Consider the sensory overload of this undertaking. The air is filled with the dust of grinding stone. The smell of piñon pine smoke clings to everything. You can hear the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of riverstones being used as hammerstones to shape the sandstone blocks. There were no metal tools here, no iron chisels, no bronze saws. Every single block used to build a city for hundreds of people was shaped by hitting a softer stone with a harder stone. The labor was immense. They had to cut Douglas fir and juniper trees from the forest above, strip the bark, and lower these massive timbers down the cliff face to serve as roof beams or vigas. The friction of rope against rock, the straining muscles of men and women, the sheer logistical nightmare of moving tons of material into a space that is effectively a swallow's nest. But as they began to lay the foundations, they encountered the first major problem of the alcove. The floor was not flat. It was a sloping pile of loose rubble and sliding shale. Before they could build a single wall, they had to stabilize the earth. They had to build retaining walls at the very lip of the precipice, backfilling them with refuse and rubble to create a level terrace. They were manufacturing ground to stand on. One heavy rain during this phase could have washed the entire foundation and the workers over the edge. The turning point, the great discovery that made this massive effort worthwhile, was a realization about the relationship between the sun and the stone. We call it passive solar design today, and we give awards to architects who use it. The Ancestral Puebloans mastered it 800 years ago. The alcoves face predominantly south or southwest. This orientation is not accidental. It is a precise astronomical calculation. Here is the science. In the summer, the sun is high in the sky. Because the dwellings are tucked deep inside the overhanging cliff, the rock roof acts as a massive awning. The city remains entirely in the shade during the hottest part of the day. While the mesa top bakes at 100 degrees, the ambient temperature in the alcove hovers comfortably in the 80s. But in the winter, the sun travels a lower arc across the southern sky. Because of the angle of the opening, the low winter sun shines directly into the back of the alcove. It strikes the masonry walls. Sandstone has high thermal mass. It absorbs the solar radiation all day long, storing it like a battery. When the sun sets and the outside air drops to zero, the stones release that stored heat back into the dwellings. They had built a machine that heated itself in winter and cooled itself in summer without a single moving part. However, discovering the thermal properties of the alcove was the easy part. To make these cities habitable, they had to bind the stones together. They needed mortar, but they didn't have lime or cement. They had mud, and relying on mud to hold up a 4-story tower on the edge of a cliff presented a terrifying risk. If the chemistry of the mix was wrong, the first monsoon rain wouldn't just wet the walls, it would dissolve the city. The engineering of the mortar was a process of desperate refinement. They couldn't just use wet dirt. It would crack and crumble as it dried. They developed a specific recipe, a mixture of clay-rich soil, water, and ash. The ash acted as a chemical stabilizer. But they went further. They realized that a thick layer of mud mortar was a weak point. It would shrink and separate from the stone blocks. To solve this, they engaged in a technique called chinking. As the mason laid the block and the wet mortar, he would press small broken shards of stone or pottery into the wet mud joints. You can still see these today, thousands of tiny stone slivers wedged between the large blocks. This served two purposes. First, it displaced the mud, reducing the volume of material that could shrink and crack. Second, it created a stone-on-stone contact point that transferred the massive vertical load of the walls down to the bedrock, rather than resting the weight on the compressible mud. The tactile reality of building these rooms was claustrophobic and intense. The stones were shaped with a technique called pecking and grinding. A builder would spend hours tapping a sandstone block with a harder hammerstone to create a flat face. The texture of the walls was smooth, often covered in a plaster made of varied colored clays, reds, whites, and ochres. They painted the interior walls, sometimes with geometric designs, sometimes with murals of daily life. These were not dark, dreary caves. They were vibrant, colorful apartments. The wooden beams, the vigas, were laid across the top of the walls, then covered with a lattice of smaller sticks, then bark, then mud to seal the roof. But as the towers grew taller, reaching 3 or 4 stories, the weight became enormous. The builders had to understand load distribution intuitively. They built walls that tapered slightly inward, battering them back against the cliff face for stability. But then, the crisis hit. The very geology that protected them began to turn against them. Sandstone is porous. It acts like a hard sponge. When it rains on the mesa top above, the water percolates down through the rock until it hits a layer of shale it cannot pass through. It then moves horizontally, seeping out of the canyon walls. This is good for drinking water. It created springs right in the back of their caves. But for a building made of mud mortar, it was a disaster. During the winter freeze-thaw cycles, moisture in the rock behind the dwellings would expand as it froze. Massive slabs of the alcove roof, weighing tons, could detach and crash down on the village. This is called spalling. The builders were living in a geological kill zone. Furthermore, the smoke from hundreds of fires began to choke the alcove. The natural airflow in a cave is poor. The smoke would rise, hit the ceiling, and bank down, filling the living space with carbon monoxide. They were warm, safe from enemies, and protected from the sun, but they were slowly poisoning themselves. Here is the paradox. The deeper they built into the shelter to escape the elements, the more they suffocated. To survive the toxic air of their own success, they had to invent a ventilation system that utilized fluid dynamics principles that wouldn't be formally described by physicists for another 700 years. They turned their attention to the kiva. The kiva was the spiritual and social center of the household, a round subterranean room often built into the rubble at the front of the alcove. It was where they prayed, wove cloth, and survived the coldest nights. But structurally, it was an engineering marvel of aerodynamics. The kiva required a fire for heat and ceremony. In a buried room, a fire consumes oxygen and produces smoke. Without a chimney, the occupants die. The Ancestral Puebloans designed a complex ventilation intake system. They built a vertical shaft in the wall of the kiva that ran from the floor up to the outside air. Fresh, cold air, being denser, would naturally flow down this shaft into the room. But if that cold air just rushed in, it would hit the fire directly, blowing ash and smoke all over the room and cooling the space too rapidly. So they built a deflector wall, a masonry block placed directly between the vent opening and the fire pit. When the cold air rushed down the shaft, it hit the deflector and was forced to split and circulate around the perimeter of the room. As it warmed up from the ambient heat, it would gently move toward the center, feeding the fire with oxygen. The hot smoke, now buoyant, would rise straight up through the hatch in the roof, which also served as the entrance ladder. This created a continuous, self-regulating convection loop. Fresh air in, circulation, combustion, exhaust out. They had created a negative pressure system that kept the room smokeless and warm even when a blizzard raged outside. They also plastered the walls of the kiva with multiple layers of fine clay, insulating it further. The chemistry of the plaster was refined to be hard and smooth, reflecting the light of the fire, making the room bright with only a few embers. The ultimate test came in the depths of the 13th century. The tree ring data tells us of a great drought that lasted for 23 years. The winters were brutally cold and the summers were scorching. Crop yields on the mesa top plummeted. Competition for resources turned into conflict. There is archaeological evidence of violence, raids, skirmishes. Imagine a night in mid-January during this era. Outside the alcove, the canyon is gripped by a temperature of 10 degrees below zero. The wind is howling down the canyon corridor, a funnel of freezing air. On the mesa top, any remaining pite-houses are buried in snow, their occupants shivering, burning through their wood stockpiles just to stay alive. But inside the cliff palace, the scene is radically different. The massive sandstone arch of the alcove deflects the wind up and over the village. The heat stored in the rock from the day's sun is radiating outward. Inside the kivas, families are gathered. The air is clear and warm, maintained by the deflector stones. They are safe from the cold, but they are also prepared for the human threat. The architecture reflects a siege mentality. To enter the dwelling, one must climb a retractable wooden ladder. The doorways are T-shaped, wide at the top, narrow at the bottom. This isn't just aesthetic. If an enemy tries to enter, the narrow bottom forces them to enter one leg at a time or to drop their shield and weapons to squeeze through. It creates a fatal bottleneck. A grandmother with a heavy stone mano, grinding tool, could defend that doorway against a warrior. They had built a fortress that used the landscape as a weapon. The result of this engineering genius was a golden age of habitation that lasted for nearly a century in the cliffs. At its peak, Mesa Verde and the surrounding areas supported thousands of people. They built multi-story towers like the Square Tower House, reaching 4 stories high, plastered and painted, visible from miles away like a beacon. The data confirms their success. Modern thermal studies of these alcoves show that even without fire, the interior temperature of the masonry rooms stays consistently between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the outside weather. With a small fire, it becomes a comfortable 70 degrees. They achieved a thermal stability that modern buildings spend thousands of dollars in energy costs to replicate. Their water management systems were equally brilliant. They built check dams on the mesa top to slow the runoff of the few rains that fell, forcing the water to soak into the ground rather than flashing off into the canyon. This recharged the seeps in the alcoves below. They engineered the flow of water through the very rock they lived in. They survived the beginning of the Great Drought because their architecture was a reservoir for heat, for cool air, and for safety. But in the end, even the greatest engineering has its limits. By the late 1200s, the ancestral Puebloans walked away. They left their pots by the hearths, their grain in the granaries, and their tools on the floor, and they marched south. The drought became too long, the resources too scarce, the social pressure too high. They didn't vanish. They became the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma. But they left behind a lesson written in stone. We often look at history as a linear progression, assuming we are smarter, more advanced, more capable than those who came before. But when you stand in the silence of Cliff Palace, looking at the precision of the masonry and the genius of the solar orientation, you realize that is a lie. They didn't have computers or cranes or fossil fuels. But they had a profound understanding of where they were. They didn't fight the desert, they danced with it. They understood the geometry of the sun and the physics of the air better than most of us do today. We build glass boxes in the desert and pump them full of refrigerated air, fighting the environment every second of every day. They built stone nests that breathed with the seasons. It makes you wonder, if the power went out tomorrow, whose house would still be livable? Ours or theirs? If you want to discover more forgotten ancient technologies that helped humanity survive, subscribe now and comment below. What type of ancient shelter should we explore next?